Welcome to Paranormal Pages. Let's get straight into the true scary stories. The Whispering Glass. The house had always been old, far older than anyone in my family could trace. It stood on the edge of the forest like a relic from a time no one wanted to remember, weathered gray stone framed by twisted branches. Inside, the air always seemed to hang heavy with dust, thick with memories no one spoke of. It wasn't until recently, though, that I noticed the chill. Every time I walked down the hallway on the second floor, past that ancient mirror, its tarnished gold frame clinging desperately to the past, I felt it. A deep, cold breath against my neck, like fingers made of ice trailing down my spine. At first, I dismissed it as a draft. The house was full of them, windows that didn't quite shut properly, gaps between the old stones where the wind crept through. But the chill near the mirror was different. It wasn't random. It was deliberate, timed perfectly with my steps, as though it waited for me, followed me with a whisper I couldn't hear but somehow felt beneath my skin. I remember stopping one night, staring into the glass, watching my own reflection. My breath fogged the surface, but something else lingered there, something I couldn't explain. My sister, Lydia, used to say the house was alive. She had a wild imagination, always spinning stories about ghosts and ancient curses. I never took her seriously, but the way her eyes darted around whenever she walked down the hall unnerved me. "There's something wrong with that mirror," she'd say, her voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's watching us." I'd laugh it off, of course. But the more time passed, the more I couldn't shake the feeling she might be right. One evening, while I was alone in the house, I decided to confront it. The sun was sinking low, casting long shadows across the hallway. I stood in front of the mirror, my heart pounding louder than I cared to admit. For the first time, I really looked at it, not just at my reflection but deeper, into the glass itself. It was like looking into a pool of dark water, something vast and cold beneath the surface. As I leaned in closer, the chill grew stronger, but this time, I realized something terrifying. The breath, it wasn't mine. I stumbled back, gasping, the realization hitting me like a punch to the chest. My breath hadn't fogged the glass, but there was a faint condensation, as though someone, or something, had exhaled from the other side. A shape flickered in the corner of my vision, just for a second, but it was enough. I was no longer alone. Something had been waiting, watching, and now I had noticed it. The air around me grew colder, and I swear I could hear it now, a faint, rasping breath, like someone struggling for air just behind the glass. My hands trembled as I reached for the door at the end of the hall, trying to force myself to leave. But I couldn't. I was rooted in place, staring at the mirror, knowing that if I looked away, I might miss it. Whatever it was there, and it was waiting for me to acknowledge it. That night, I didn't sleep. How could I? The mirror was more than just an object now. It was a doorway. And something on the other side was knocking. Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. The knocking didn't start until 3 nights later. At first, it was subtle, almost like the faint ticking of a clock, coming from the direction of the hallway. I told myself it was just the house settling, an old structure groaning under the weight of time. But as the hours passed, the sound grew louder, more distinct, like knuckles rapping against wood. Only, it wasn't coming from a door. It was coming from the mirror. I tried to ignore it, burying my head beneath the covers like a child afraid of the dark. But I could feel it. That cold pressure in the air, creeping into my room like an unwelcome guest. There was no escaping it now. The mirror wasn't just a thing hanging on the wall, it was a presence. A breathing, watching, and now knocking presence. And it wanted something from me. I lay there, rigid in bed, listening as the knocking grew more insistent, until it felt like it was coming from inside my head, demanding attention. The next morning, Lydia returned. I hadn't expected her, but seeing her standing on the doorstep, her usual wild smile replaced by something more serious, unsettled me. "I had a dream about the house," she said without so much as a greeting. "About the mirror." Her words hung in the air, thick with a dread I hadn't realized we both shared. She stepped inside, her eyes darting immediately toward the hallway where the mirror stood. "Have you heard it yet?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I hesitated. There was no point in lying, not to her. "It's been knocking," I admitted, my throat dry. "At night. It sounds like someone is trying to get out." Lydia nodded as if this was something she had long known but dreaded to confirm. "It started with me, too," she said, glancing at the floor. "I thought leaving would help, but it's not done with us." She looked up, her face pale. "There's something inside that mirror." Her words chilled me to my core. "What do you mean, something?" I asked, even though deep down, I already knew the answer. The knocking, the breath, it wasn't just a figment of my imagination. There was something, or someone, trapped within that glass, something desperate enough to reach out, to knock, and now, I feared, to come through. "We have to face it," Lydia continued, pulling me toward the hallway. My legs felt heavy, but I followed her. The mirror loomed ahead, its surface dull and clouded. The knocking had stopped, but I could feel the presence still there, just beyond the glass. "I tried to break it once," Lydia confessed, her voice trembling. "But it wouldn't shatter. It's indestructible." "Then what are we supposed to do?" I asked, my own fear bubbling up, filling my voice with a raw edge. Lydia didn't answer right away. Instead, she knelt in front of the mirror, her hand hovering just inches from the surface. "It's trying to come through," she whispered. "It wants to be free. But if we let it, I don't think it'll stop." Suddenly, the air grew colder, and I felt that familiar breath, icy and deliberate, at the back of my neck. I staggered backward as Lydia's hand pressed against the glass. The surface rippled like water, and for a moment, I saw it, a figure on the other side, its hand pressed against Lydia's, its face hidden in the shadowy depths. The knocking started again, louder, faster, like someone pounding to be let out. Lydia gasped, her eyes wide. "It's coming," she breathed. I yanked Lydia back before her hand could sink any deeper into the mirror's surface. Her fingers trembled, as though they had been brushing against something freezing on the other side. She looked at me, wide-eyed, her breath coming out in sharp gasps. "Did you see it?" she asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. "It was right there, watching me." I nodded, my mouth dry, words trapped in my throat. I had seen it, the faint outline of a figure, its face indistinct but filled with an unnatural hunger. The hallway felt impossibly small, like the walls were closing in on us. The knocking from the mirror had stopped again, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. It pressed against my ears, thick and oppressive, as though the air itself was holding its breath. I forced myself to speak. What is it?" The question came out shaky, but I needed to know. "Why is it after us?" Lydia shook her head, her lips trembling. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think it's been there for as long as the house has stood. Maybe longer." She glanced back at the mirror, her face pale. "I used to think it was just in my head, that the house was playing tricks on me. But when I left, I couldn't escape it. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it. And now, it's stronger. It's not just watching anymore, it's trying to get out." I felt a cold sweat trickle down my back as her words sank in. I had always felt something was wrong with the house, but I had never let myself believe it was more than just superstition. Now, standing in front of that ancient mirror, with the memory of the figure still fresh in my mind, there was no denying it. The mirror was not a reflection, it was a prison. "We have to destroy it," I said, the urgency rising in my chest. "We can't let it come through." I stepped closer to the mirror, my fists clenched, determined to shatter the glass. But as I raised my hand, something stopped me, an overwhelming feeling of dread, as though the thing inside the mirror was daring me, waiting for me to strike. I hesitated, and in that moment, the glass rippled again, the surface warping as if it were alive. A face began to form, pushing against the glass from the other side. This time, I could see it clearly, pale and twisted, its eyes black voids, its mouth stretched in a grotesque grin. It pressed closer, its hands appearing next, thin and skeletal, clawing at the barrier between us. I staggered back, my heart hammering in my chest. The breath against my neck was no longer subtle. It was a deep, rasping exhale, as if the thing was standing right behind me, just inches away. "Don't let it out," Lydia screamed, grabbing my arm. "Once it's free, we're both dead." The face in the mirror snarled, the glass distorting with its fury. Cracks began to spider across the surface, small at first, but growing larger, spreading like veins of a living thing. I could hear it, the creature's voice now, low and guttural, speaking in words that made no sense, yet filled the air with a deep and ancient malevolence. The mirror shook violently as though it couldn't contain the thing any longer. I turned to Lydia, panic rising in my throat. "We have to run," I shouted. "We can't stop it." But Lydia stood frozen, her eyes locked on the face in the glass. "It's almost through," she whispered, as though in a trance. "It's breaking free." I grabbed Lydia by the arm, pulling her away from the mirror just as the cracks splintered across its surface with a sickening groan. The face inside was no longer a shadow, it was real, pushing against the barrier with a force that sent tremors through the entire hallway. The glass, once impossibly solid, now seemed brittle, barely holding back the thing clawing its way through. "We have to go," I shouted, yanking Lydia harder. But she resisted, her eyes fixed on the cracks widening in the mirror, mesmerized by the horror taking shape before us. "Lydia!" I screamed again, my voice thick with panic. "It's almost out." I could hear the voice now, clearer than before. It wasn't just in my head anymore. It was everywhere, seeping into the walls, filling the air with a sound like nails scraping across bone. Lydia blinked as though waking from a deep sleep, finally tearing her gaze from the mirror. "Run," she gasped, and together, we sprinted down the hallway, the floorboards creaking beneath our feet as though the house itself was coming apart. Behind us, the mirror shattered with a deafening crack, and the cold, unnatural air rushed out like a freezing wind, chasing us down the narrow corridor. I didn't dare look back. I could feel it, whatever had been trapped in the mirror was no longer confined. It was loose. Its breath was in my ear, its presence filling the space around us. We reached the stairs, stumbling down them two at a time, the house groaning and shaking as if in the grip of a terrible force. But even as we reached the front door, I knew it wasn't over. There was no escaping it. The thing had followed us for too long, had waited too long, and now it was free. We burst out into the cold night air, slamming the door behind us. For a moment, the only sound was our ragged breathing and the distant creak of the house settling back into silence. But the silence didn't last long. From inside, there came a soft sound, the unmistakable knock. Slow, deliberate, as if mocking us. I turned to Lydia, her face pale under the moonlight. "It's not over," I whispered, my voice shaking. Lydia nodded, her eyes wide with terror. "It's out," she said. "It's free." Suddenly, the front door creaked open behind us, even though we hadn't touched it. The cold that seeped from within was unlike anything I had ever felt before, as though it came from the depths of some place forgotten by time, untouched by life. Lydia turned toward the door, her face stiff with dread. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Before I could answer, a shadow moved at the threshold, dark and formless at first, but slowly taking shape. The figure that stepped out into the moonlight was no longer a distant face behind the glass. It was here, standing before us, its body twisted and wrong, its eyes two black, endless voids. It tilted its head toward us, as if studying us, savoring the fear it had waited so long to taste. My body froze. I wanted to run, to scream, to fight, but nothing came. All I could do was stand there, watching as the thing from the mirror took its first step toward us. It opened its mouth, wide and unnatural, a chilling smile that stretched far too wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. And then, it spoke. "You let me out," it whispered, its voice a low, rasping echo. "Now it's your turn." I stepped back, my heart hammering in my chest as Lydia's hand gripped my arm. The creature took another step forward, its breath filling the air around us, cold and suffocating. I could feel its presence pressing against me, like a weight I couldn't shake. The mirror had been the only thing keeping it at bay, and now it was here, hungry, unstoppable. "We need to run," I managed to choke out, my voice trembling. But the creature's smile only widened. "There's nowhere to run." Hey! Subscribe for more true scary stories. Story 2. The Window. When I first moved into the apartment, it seemed perfect. It was an old building, but it had that timeless charm I had been searching for. The place felt alive, with every creak of the floorboards and draft from the high, narrow windows. My favorite part was the painting above the fireplace. It was a large, ornately framed piece, depicting a view of the countryside from a window. Rolling hills, an old oak tree in the distance, and a faint mist creeping along the horizon. It seemed odd for the painting to have been left behind, but it gave the room character. At first, I thought nothing of it. The painting was just a painting. But after a few days, something began gnawing at me. The scene seemed different somehow, like the mist was denser, or the tree slightly closer to the frame. I chalked it up to exhaustion from unpacking and adjusting to a new routine. It was ridiculous, the idea that a painting could change. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. One evening, after returning from work, I stood before the painting. The mist in the image seemed thicker than I remembered, now swirling at the base of the tree. I leaned in closer, trying to study the details. There, in the distance, was something new. A faint figure stood at the edge of the horizon. It was small, almost imperceptible, but undeniably there. I blinked several times, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the figure remained. I told myself it was just my mind running wild. Old paintings often had imperfections, or perhaps I'd just missed this particular detail before. Still, a strange unease settled over me. That night, I had trouble sleeping, my mind drifting back to the figure in the painting, wondering what it could mean. My dreams were plagued by visions of mist-covered fields and shadowy figures creeping closer and closer. The next day, I inspected the painting again. The figure was still there, but this time, it was no longer a faint silhouette. It had moved, closer to the oak tree now, its form slightly more distinct. It looked like a person, but the details were still too blurred to make out. The mist had grown thicker too, creeping up the hills and consuming more of the landscape. I could feel a chill settle in the room, the temperature seeming to drop as I stared at the painting. I pulled myself away, shaking my head. "You're imagining things," I muttered, trying to laugh it off. But deep down, I knew something was terribly wrong. That night, as I lay in bed, I could swear I heard faint whispers, like wind passing through a narrow crack. The sound seemed to come from the direction of the living room, where the painting hung, waiting. The next morning, the apartment felt different. Not just colder, but heavier, like the air itself was pressing down on me. The thought of the painting gnawed at me, so I forced myself to confront it. I stood in front of it once again, my heart racing, trying to convince myself it was all in my head. But the scene had changed again. The figure was now unmistakable, closer, standing directly beneath the oak tree. It had taken shape. Its form was still hazy, but I could see it was draped in something dark and tattered, like a cloak or robe. The mist around the figure swirled violently, almost alive, stretching toward the tree. And the tree itself. I could swear its branches had moved, now crooked and twisted like hands reaching out to the figure below. I stepped back, suddenly lightheaded. "This can't be real," I whispered. My breath came in short bursts as I tried to calm myself. I considered taking the painting down, but an odd compulsion stopped me. It was like the painting needed to stay where it was, as if removing it would somehow make everything worse. I backed away slowly, fighting the urge to look over my shoulder, the feeling of being watched stronger than ever. Later that night, the whispers returned, but louder this time, more insistent. I could no longer pass it off as wind. They weren't just sounds, they were voices. My body froze, my ears straining to make sense of the indistinct words. I crept to the living room, the floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The painting seemed to glow faintly in the dim light, pulling me in. As I stepped closer, I heard a soft scratching sound. My heart thudded in my chest. It was coming from the painting itself, as if something inside it was trying to claw its way out. My hands trembled as I reached for the edge of the frame, drawn toward it against my will. Then, just as my fingers grazed the wood, the whispering stopped. I yanked my hand back, nearly falling over. Something in the air shifted, the silence growing oppressive. I didn't dare touch the painting again. Instead, I ran back to my bedroom, slamming the door shut behind me. But sleep was impossible. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the figure beneath the oak tree, its dark shape inching ever closer, pulling itself through the mist. The next morning, I found a local art dealer to take a look at the painting. If anyone could explain what was happening, it had to be someone knowledgeable about old works. When the dealer arrived, he stared at the painting for an uncomfortably long time, his eyes narrowing in concentration. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice unusually low. "It came with the apartment," I replied, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't respond at first. He just leaned in closer, his face pale, before stepping back and shaking his head. "This painting, it's not from any artist I know. But that figure, it's not part of the original design. There's something wrong here." His words sent a chill down my spine. I asked what he meant, but he wouldn't explain further. He left in a hurry, as if simply being in the apartment unsettled him. I was alone again. Alone with the painting. Alone with whatever was coming through it. I barely slept after the art dealer's visit. His reaction had confirmed my deepest fears. Something was terribly wrong, and it wasn't just in my mind. The whispers had grown more frequent, an ever-present hum in the background, like a faint chant just beyond the edge of comprehension. They were louder at night, swelling in the dark, as if trying to lure me closer to the painting. That evening, I forced myself to look at the painting once more. My heart hammered in my chest as I stood in front of it, every nerve in my body telling me to turn away. But I couldn't. The figure was now halfway between the oak tree and the window in the painting. Its features had grown clearer, gaunt, hollow eyes staring directly out of the frame. Its cloak was ragged, fluttering in an unseen wind, and the mist swirled at its feet, creeping closer to the foreground. It wasn't just a painting anymore. The closer I looked, the more it seemed alive. The landscape inside the frame wasn't a static image. The mist moved, roiling like waves, and the figure seemed to shift, ever so slightly, with each passing moment. My breath hitched as I realized the impossible, whatever this thing was, it was getting closer. Closer to the window in the painting, and by extension, closer to me. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox, intent on smashing the painting to pieces, but as I lifted it above my head, my body froze. I stood there, motionless, as though some invisible force had seized control. The whispers surged in intensity, filling the room, drowning out every rational thought. I dropped the hammer, stumbling backward, gasping for breath. That night, I tried calling a priest. Desperation had driven me to seek help, but as soon as I mentioned the painting, his voice grew quiet. "You need to leave," he said. "Whatever is tied to that painting is older than you can imagine. And it's not something you want to understand." Leave? The thought seemed simple enough, but the idea of abandoning my apartment, my life here, it felt wrong. Like the painting had woven itself into me. Every time I thought of running, something held me back. Fear, yes, but also something deeper, like I was trapped in its orbit. As the night wore on, the whispers shifted, becoming clearer. The words, they were in some old language, ancient and guttural. The sound of them made my skin crawl, but I could make out a pattern, a rhythm. They were beckoning me. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of scratching again, but this time it was louder, more insistent. I knew exactly where it was coming from, the painting. I crept into the living room, heart pounding, and there it was, the figure, now mere inches from the window in the frame. It was so close I could make out the fine details of its bony hands, pale and thin, clawing at the glass, as though trying to push through. The mist had fully engulfed the scene, swirling like a storm, pressing against the panes. I stumbled backward, my legs barely able to hold me up. The whispers grew louder, so loud they drowned out my own thoughts, filling every corner of my mind. And then, through the chaos, I saw it, the figure's hand. It was no longer inside the painting. Its fingers had stretched out, pushing past the frame, curling over the edge of the painting, dragging itself into my world. I screamed, scrambling back as far as I could. But the figure kept coming, slowly pulling its entire body through the window in the painting. It was almost here. I stared, paralyzed, as the figure's hand twisted out of the frame, its pale fingers gripping the air of my living room. The whispers grew deafening, now fully forming words, though I couldn't understand them. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might burst, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The figure, its entire upper body, was now halfway out of the painting, its ragged cloak hanging loosely over its skeletal frame, and its hollow eyes were fixed on me. I stumbled back, tripping over the coffee table, crashing hard onto the floor. The whispers became shrieks, like thousands of voices crying out at once, each word laced with desperation and rage. It was pulling itself out with a sickening slowness, inch by inch. The mist from the painting had begun to seep into the room, curling like smoke around the furniture, creeping along the floor. My apartment felt cold, colder than I'd ever felt before. I could see my breath in front of me, small puffs of fog in the icy air. Frantic, I scrambled to my feet and ran for the door. My hands fumbled with the lock, my shaking fingers barely able to grasp the knob. I yanked it open and bolted into the hallway, slamming it shut behind me. But I wasn't safe. I could still hear the whispers, the screeching chants, seeping through the walls, following me. I ran down the stairs, 2 at a time, my mind racing. I needed to get out, far away from whatever was crawling into my reality. I reached the street, panting, the cold night air hitting my face like a slap. But as I stood there, my breath ragged and my heart pounding, something pulled me back, something stronger than fear. I had to see it again. The thought was insane, but it was undeniable. I was tied to that thing now, and leaving wouldn't change that. Against every instinct, I found myself walking back into the building. My feet moved of their own accord as if controlled by something beyond my will. I ascended the stairs slowly, dread building with each step. By the time I reached my door, I could hear the scratching again, louder this time, more frantic. My hand hovered over the doorknob, trembling, but I pushed the door open, drawn by a force I couldn't explain. The painting had completely changed. The countryside was gone. The oak tree was no more. The window in the painting now mirrored my own, showing my apartment exactly as it was, but the figure was no longer just inside the frame. It stood in the middle of my living room now, fully here, fully real. Its hollow eyes locked onto mine, and I felt an overwhelming cold radiating from its presence, as though the room itself was being drained of warmth, of life. "You shouldn't have come back," a voice rasped. It didn't come from the figure but from all around me, inside my mind. My legs buckled, and I collapsed to the floor, the weight of terror pressing down on me like lead. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure began to glide toward me, silent except for the faint sound of its robes dragging along the floor. Its hands reached out, impossibly long fingers stretching toward me, the mist curling in tendrils behind it. The room darkened, the edges of my vision blurring as if reality itself was slipping away. It was nearly upon me, the cold suffocating, and I realized in that moment, it hadn't just been coming through the painting. It had been pulling me in. With a final, desperate effort, I reached for the hammer I had dropped earlier. My fingers wrapped around the handle, weak but determined. I swung with every ounce of strength I had left, aiming for the painting's frame. The wood splintered, and for a brief second, the whispers stopped. But the figure didn't vanish. It loomed over me now, its hollow eyes mere inches from mine, its cold breath washing over my face as it whispered, "You're already mine." Everything went dark. The end. Subscribe for more true scary stories. Thanks for watching.